Abolish the police! Abolish the police!
Welcome, everybody, to First Nation Fridays, right here on Stir Crazy, being brought to you by the Real News Network. What you just saw there was some video of the statue of a man named John A. Macdonald. This happened north of the border in Canada. John A. Macdonald was a staunch assimilationist, someone who advocated for residential schools in Canada and was generally horrible to the First Nations people of Canada. So that statue came down recently. That was posted on the account. Who posted that originally? I'm not sure who the original poster of, but Terrell Tailfeathers, a Blackfoot man, posted that video and it got retweeted a bunch of times. So that's just another way we wanted to set off our First Nation Fridays. We love to see the symbols of colonizers and genocidal people come tumbling down, especially here in the year 2020. I feel as if this is hopefully a year of new awakenings, not just in the struggle for Black lives and the movement for Black lives, but the struggle for Indigenous lives and Native American lives and First Nation lives and all of the things that surround that issue of restoration, of sovereignty, of justice. So these are the issues that we like to talk about here on First Nation Fridays. We have a whole lot of things to get into, but before we get into any of those, let's get into this panel. Let me introduce three ladies that I've gotten to know over the last several weeks, and it has me always looking forward to these Fridays. The every other Friday of the month is amongst my every other favorite Friday so far since we've been doing Stir Crazy. So joining us today, the executive director and one of the founders of Crushing Colonialism, Jen Deerenwater, journalist and activist, Desiree Kane is joining us, and Johnny J, also a journalist and activist, joining us today from California. Ladies, I'd like to thank you all so much for being here once again for First Nation Fridays. It's so wonderful to see all three of your lovely glowing faces. How's everybody doing?
Good. We love to be here.
So guys, we have several things that we're going to get into for today's First Nation Fridays. But the first thing I want to get into, and first of all, welcome to everyone that is watching on YouTube. Of course, we love to hear from you in the chat and in the comments. And if you're watching us on Periscope via Twitter, hello, nice to see your face here in the place as well. But the title of today's show is called Indian Summer. And I titled today's show just because we needed a title. And Desiree sent us a note like, I don't know about Indian summer. So I felt like this would be a good teachable moment, especially for people who are non-native, because we need to do better about removing from our regular vernacular, from the common lexicon of American phrasing, things that are offensive to all kinds of groups. But Native Americans have experienced this, I think, disproportionately in a way that perhaps other groups have not. So Desiree, you know, when I think of Indian summer, I think of extended summer or a prolonged summer, experiencing summer temperatures in the autumn months. But there are different connotations and different ways to interpret the phrase Indian summer. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, sure. I think I just chimed in to say something because usually Americans using the word Indian can be a little bit of a rub with Indigenous people. That's an antiquated word that really has been reclaimed by the Indigenous community. But we're not Indians from India. We're Native people. We're Indigenous people. And the Indian summer So socialists like to use Indian summer because there was something called the October Socialist Revolution that happened, and it really was used in the context of that. But Indian summer is a phrase that came about in the 1950s that is used to relay like warm weather, like you mentioned, but after a killing frost. And tying in Indigenous people as killers, I don't know, it could be that I'm being a bit sensitive, but maybe not. I personally feel that we should remove the word Indian out of the vernacular of Americans in place of Indigenous, or better yet, the tribe of the people who are being discussed. So that's why I brought it up, and I really appreciate that you looked at it that way, Kim, and said we should talk about this. That's like legit allyship. Thank you.
Well, of course, but I think most people who believe themselves to be on the right side of things, right? I mean, I don't want to go around just sounding ignorant, you know what I mean? So if you all can instruct me to do better, so hopefully I can instruct others to do better, then that is how we make progress. Johnny, what is your take on the phrasing of Indian summer? Do you see it as something that should not be phrased that way? Should we call it Indigenous summer, or should we just say, damn, it's hot in October? We don't have to call it anything in particular. What is your take?
I'm on the side of, let's just call it hot. and a lot of that is because, when it comes to like Native people like to put their spin on crap. It's like when you're in business, you hear people talking just so blatantly without even realizing what they're really saying. Like, they'll talk about somebody going off the reservation and not understanding where that term came from, or lowest man on the totem pole and not knowing where that came from, or that it's offensive to Indigenous people. And so, I'm in the boat of, let's just call it hot. And that way we could kind of eliminate some of that ignorance, and also eliminate normalizing using Indigenous people in a context that really doesn't make sense, because Indian summer, was there a summer where we all just ran wild, or, did we have our own Coachella? Like, I don't really understand how that term came about, but, I think it's time to retire it.
Jen, when people say phrases that either invoke the word Indian or involve things associated with Indian cultures, a couple of which Johnny just named, but they say, oh, but I didn't mean anything by it. Like, oh, I didn't mean any harm. Tell everybody why that is just not good enough, and why that does not fly, and why that does not work.
Well, I think Desiree and Johnny have hit a lot of the main points that I would have covered. But here, I'm going to give a personal example of why it matters. So many years ago, I was in the emergency room, and I was really sick, and it was due to an issue of domestic violence, and the partner at the time was there with me, and I was getting really horrible care in the hospital, in the ER. And at one point, one of the nurses said, "Ooh, deer in water. Are you an Indian?" And I looked at him, and I was like, "No, I'm not an Indian." And he pushes again, and I was like, "Look, I'm not an Indian. Like, Indians are from India. I'm Indigenous. Like, I'm Cherokee Nation." And then he gets really rude and all, "Well, you know what I meant." And it was like, yeah, I do know what you mean. And one, it's none of your business. Two, I'm here really sick on the verge of death due to domestic violence. And why am I having to teach you this? So like for me, that right there is just this constant dehumanization of Native people, and I get really tired of oh, it's not a big deal, you're just being sensitive, gaslighting, because it is a big deal, and we're not being sensitive. And even if we were, we have every damn right to be, after, all the horrible things that have been done to us and we're still going through.
Mhm.
Agree, 100%. And when Desiree said, I might be being sensitive. No, you're not being sensitive. You're actually being rather patient by, tolerating it and then taking the time to explain why that's not a good phrasing. And from the comments already, Schultze 100 says, okay, dropping that from my lexicon. Oops. And that's good, because when you know better, you do better, right? And I think there's a lot of people out here operating from two forms of ignorance, like genuine ignorance, like, no, I really didn't know, or the form of ignorance, well, I knew, but I didn't care because this is how I like to speak, and I'm just going to go ahead and say what I want to say. And if you're offended, well, that's your fault for being offended. No, we don't want to be the latter kind of ignorant. Like we can get out of the first kind of ignorance by just being educated. So that's how we want to be. So thank you very much, all three of you, for taking the time to point out why that's not really the best way to do things.
Could I add one more thing?
Oh, by all means, yes.
So when people say, oh, well, that was not my intention, right? So we talk about in the realm of social justice and being good to one another about the difference between your actual impact and your intention, because I can punch you in the face but not mean to, but it still hurts, so you have to think about the actual impact of how those words are being used. And I think with Indigenous issues and Indigenous language a lot, people have the question, well, if you don't want me to say Indian, what should I say? That's a pretty common question just because people don't know. The American education system doesn't inform anybody about Native truth. And so the answer to that is usually when you're addressing an individual, if you know their tribe, you should be referring to them by their tribe. And if you don't know their tribe, it's probably safer just to say Indigenous or Native, but really probably don't use Indian. That was a misnomer because Columbus thought he was landing in India, and we're not in India. So, yeah.
Isn't that amazing? Like the pervasive ignorance of a colonizing European has managed to survive for hundreds of years. And people still use the terminology that this dumb son of a bitch used 500 years ago. And here we are still doing it today. Like, oh, well, we didn't know. No, it's been 500 years, goddammit. We should fucking know by now and be doing way, way better. Way, way better. I see all the nodding heads. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And it also, it kind of goes back to just like everybody have an agency over how they want to be identified as. It's like if Natives want to say, oh, because I work with a lot of different organizations. One of my favorites is Indian Youth of America. Like if we want to say Indian, and I also call myself the Indian in the bubble because, I'm basically in a bubble. I think it just like asks people how they want to be identified rather than just guessing or assuming, because, it's better because, there's some people, and it's such a huge conversation in any country. If you ask somebody, what do you prefer to be called? Because there's some people that would prefer to be called Aboriginal. There are people who have issues with that term. You have Indigenous, but there are also Natives who have issues with being called Indigenous. So, it's better just to ask an individual like how they would like to be identified as rather than just assuming, because you never know what Native you're talking to, and you don't want to, offend somebody. And even if unmeaning to or just an accident, you never know. And you could get punched in the face. I mean, just out of ignorance, I've had people constantly, make references to, oh, you look like Pocahontas, or, trying to find those little pet names, and I think the one I hate the most is when people call me Tiger Lily, because I did have a job interview where, it seemed to go fine. But then as I was walking out, he picked up the phone and he was like, that's a no on Tiger Lily. And I was like, what the flip? Like, what? And so I have issues with that. So, it's better to ask people like what they prefer to be identified, and don't assume and don't try to use pet names if you don't know the person or you don't have a connection. because it's bad. It's just bad all around. So I think it's just better to, kind of understand if you hear a Native and they're referring to themselves as an Indian, that's okay for them to do it, but it's not okay for you to do it. You know what I mean?
Let me ask you guys a question before we move on to the next thing, because just from having this conversation, just thinking about experiences over my life and how I have witnessed Native American people being referred to or being treated, I feel as though racism against Native people is way more tolerated than it is against other groups. And we all know this is America, white supremacy reigns supreme, and they will break out that racism against any and everybody, even intra-white racism, when we get into the hierarchy of how Europeans see themselves. But I feel as though casual racism against Native people is par for the course. And I think the name of the Washington football team being allowed to persist for as many decades and generations as it did is a really good example of that. Also, the mask.
Well, that's awkward.
Did we lose Kim? All right.
Please give voice to that way better than what I'm doing. I mean, all the time, the casual racism against Natives is far too common than I think it is against Black people or even other communities of color.
I'm constantly amazed at the things that people say. And I understand sometimes it's not malicious in intent and it's based in ignorance, I mean, I myself am certainly guilty of saying and doing things that were messed up that I didn't realize it at the time. But man, the things that people will say about Natives and the things that they will and won't tolerate, I've been in so many spaces, just since you brought up the mascot thing. Living here in DC, I've been in so many, quote, safe spaces around here that have zero problem with people walking in covered in mascot stuff. And I've brought that to the attention of there's a queer women's bar here. I can't remember the name of it. It's A League of Her Own. Yeah, I was in there and there were some people covered in this mascot stuff, and they've got a huge mural on their wall saying if you're here, this is a safer space and we won't tolerate racism, etc. And I went up to their bartender and was like, listen, you all need to tell these people to turn their shirts inside out or something. I was like, because this isn't okay. They didn't even understand what I meant when I said I'm Native, or I also said Indigenous. They still had no clue. I had to go, I'm an American Indian, which I hate that term. But then they went, oh, well, we can't tell people what to wear. And I looked at them and I was like, so if somebody came in here wearing some blatant anti-queer slur, you'd let them stay? Or are you going to kick them out? You're probably going to kick them out, but you're going to let people wear mascot stuff. I know that that's been a big point of contention in some organizing spaces in DC is Native people saying, look, we want to be here, but if you're going to let people walk in wearing this stuff, this isn't an event for us. It's clearly not about us, and
Don't feel honored, Jen?
Oh, yeah, I feel so honored. And, I think the other thing that makes it difficult is that when you have Natives, people who are genuinely Native, who are light like myself, I go saying, look, you're being anti-Native. This is being racist towards Natives. And especially if I'm saying this to a person of color, I get the, you look white. How dare you say I'm racist? You don't know what racism is. And it's different when you're dealing with it from white people versus BIPOC folks, and by no means am I saying Natives don't do things to perpetuate harm against other folks of color. We absolutely do. We have our own problems to be dealt with. But I think that adds kind of a dynamic to it that's a difficult. I think one of the other issues, and I specifically have this as a Cherokee as well, is that there are a lot of white people out there that like to say and do really racist things. And then when you call them on it, they say, oh, I'm not racist. I'm Native American. I'm Cherokee. You know? So when I do tell people, like, look, I'm Cherokee, like what you're saying is offensive, they don't think that what I'm saying is real and that I'm just one of those racist white people, you know, doing that stuff. So I think there are a lot of reasons that the casual racism against Native people is so tolerated. And I don't know, I think education's important, but there's also just a point where, like, when non-natives look at us, they just see our land. That's all they see. They see what they can take from us for the most part. So I think even with education, there's still just going to be those people that are like, we need those Indians dead and gone.
Ugh.
So,
Well, that's disheartening.
Hey, so glad I could come in with all the positive energy.
I mean, your earrings alone are giving me life. So we've got some balance here.
Thank you. I've been wanting to do this forever, but I got a medallion made with my organization.
Awesome.
Here, let me go. There we go. With my organization's logo on it. So it says Crushing Colonialism.
Oh, dope.
And it was by RNN. There we go. Anyway, he made it for me. And so today's the first day I'm wearing it. And I was like, oh, let me get out my yellow earrings by Colored Girls Hustle. There we go. And normally I wouldn't be giving free advertising to people, but, you know, Native and Black women and, you know, folks. So go buy their goods.
We are totally here for it. Well, speaking of casual racism against Native people, there was a hashtag that was floating around social media this week. Hashtag stroke a hauntist. Listen to me. Dwayne, we have a video for that. Let's run that. And then I want Desiree to come enlighten us about hashtag stroke a hauntist.
Stroke a hauntist is now trending because there was a book that reported that Donald Trump had multiple mini strokes in November and Mike Pence was put on standby to take over the presidency. And he denied it. It never ends. Now they're trying to say that your favorite president, me, went to Walter Reed Medical Center having suffered a series of mini strokes. Never happened to this candidate. Fake news. Perhaps they're referring to another candidate from another party. And as you can see, people are having fun with it. We do have, of course, as I said, here's his tweet here. His supporters are, release your medical records. That'd be pretty simple, right? Must release the history and physical documentation from his visit to Walter Reed Medical Center. The chief complaint and history of the president's illness section should detail exactly why President Trump visited the hospital. It's not much to ask from the commander-in-chief. And of course, clips like this are spreading because it sounds like someone who's had a couple strokes.
It's water. And then they have cans of soup. And they throw the cans of soup. That's better than a brick because you can't throw a brick. It's too heavy. But a can of soup, you can really put some power into that, right?
Yes, sir.
And then when they get caught, they say,
Yes,
this
sir.
is soup from my family. They're so innocent. This is soup from my family. It's incredible. And you have people coming over with bags of soup, big bags of soup, and they lay it on the ground, and the anarchists take it, and they start throwing it at our cops, at our police. And if it hits you, that's worse than a brick because it's got force. It's the perfect size. It's like made perfect. And when they get caught, they say, no, this is just soup for my family. And then the media says, this is just soup. These people are very, very innocent.
Pictures like,
They're
oh my,
innocent
he's losing
people.
it.
These are just protesters. Isn't it wonderful to allow protesting? No. And by the way, the media knows it better than we do. They know what's going on. I don't know what's wrong with them. They're doing our country a
Can't keep up with the conspiracy. Soup people and shadows. We can't find the soup cans.
Okay. Who was that dude, by the way? I thought one of you guys put that video on the doc because I didn't know who that guy was. Not that it
I
matters.
don't know who that
I
person is.
threw it in there, but I didn't know who he was. It was just one of the first things I could find.
Well, that's fair.
Mhm.
So let's parse this out. So this was obviously anti-Trump people pushing this hashtag as a joke, in a reverse joke, I guess, because Trump refers to Elizabeth Warren in that way, using the name Pocahontas. So this was liberals' way to own Trump by flipping the name in a way that was derogatory towards him. But no, it doesn't work that way. Desiree, explain to us why this was even trending and who was the main people that you saw utilizing this hashtag.
Oh my word, it was leftists, like liberals, right? So, and Democrats, not progressives.
allies.
It was us, being terribly not just like anti-native, but that was extremely like ableist and ugly, right? To just go for President Trump at the expense of folks who have experienced strokes, who it has impacted their life, and Native women. Pocahontas is the most famous missing and murdered Indigenous woman. Everybody's heard of her. We have an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And it goes back to, President Trump. He's trying to get a dig on Elizabeth Warren and her whole genealogy debacle, which I can only describe it as like a dumpster fire. But going after President Trump at the expense of Indigenous people and at the expense of people who have experienced medical issues, that's just, it's like not cool. It's very ugly. It's tacky. And frankly, it's got racial overtones that are just disgusting. We don't need to stoop to his level as the left to get a dig on this terrible rapist, sexist president. And that's what happened. The left was like, oh, haha, like no education about Native people or Native struggles. We're just going to go for it. Ha, ha, ha. But what actually happened was Native women were degraded. And I don't think that that's a win, right? You don't go after Trump by harming Indigenous people and folks that have experienced a stroke. It's just ugly. I really appreciated Rebecca Nagel. She's a media maker and journalist, actually from Jen's community. She's Cherokee. Her commentary was really good. If you want to go look up Rebecca Nagel for more like expanded context. But basically, it was so uncalled for and just completely like big time cringeworthy.
Johnny J, I know that you had a couple of threads put together about Strokeahannas on Twitter. What are your thoughts about what you saw and who you saw it coming from? And I guess the willful ignorance, is it safe to call it that, or intentional ignorance of
Definitely.
so-called leftist, so-called woke people gleefully
Exactly.
using this term against Trump?
So very intentional, because this isn't the first time. Just like earlier this year, it was Brokahontas, again, trying to throw a jab at Trump, and it was uncalled for. So Native people have for years been giving non-Natives education, resources to understand that when you do variations on Pocahontas' name, you're disrespecting her legacy, you're disrespecting her living relatives and her people, and you're not letting her spirit rest. And there's so many resources, and Native people have said it time and time again that this is not okay. When Brokahontas happened, Native people were right there trying to educate people that this is not okay. You think you're hurting Trump, but you're not. You're degrading Indigenous people. And I was so angry with this one because I did see a tweet from an account, and I was laughing because it just made me so angry that this person was trying to defend their use of this term and was like, I will step on anybody. I will do anything to weaken Trump. And I was sitting there thinking, like, how does that weaken Trump? Because this is a man who is unapologetically racist. He is a sociopath. He does not give a crap what you say about him. It does not hurt him. It doesn't hurt his feelings. It doesn't weaken him or his campaign at all. But what it does is it degrades Native women. It degrades Pocahontas. It degrades this just idea that you're supposed to be better. Like, you want people to say, oh, Democrats are better, leftists are better. We're not like maggots. But here you are acting just like them. Like, there's no difference. And it kind of goes back to, what we've said in this panel time and time again, when it comes to Democrats and Republicans, same wings on, different wings on the same bird. There's no difference in the way that they behave. They don't care about justice. They don't care about liberty. They don't care about even America. What they're worried about is this political pissing contest that they have between each other and just wanting to throw jabs. They don't care who gets hurt. Like, they have no moral conscience at this point. And I really wish they would stop pretending to, because if they wanted to be better, if they wanted to prove that they were the better choice, then they would be behaving better. And it is so disgusting. Like, I am so angry about it. But also, I think it's important that when you're discussing Pocahontas, you really need to defer to her living relatives and to her tribe, who have said time and time again to let her spirit rest. Keep her name out of your mouth. Let her spirit rest. And it goes for natives too, because there's so many natives who are not from her tribe who, try to take this narrative. And, it's been kind of ongoing where because of the missing, murdered Indigenous women, that it just makes sense that because of Pocahontas' story that she would be lumped into that. But her people have said time and time again, please don't do that. It was a different context and we need to let her spirit rest. Don't be trying to bring her back and use her as a mascot for a movement that is current. Don't try to use her as a commodification of that movement, or to bring it around to where it's just something that so people are so familiar with, because it's so horrible to say this, but we all know in different movements a lot of things start getting commodified. People start trying to brand, people start trying to sell t-shirts, or it gets out of hand. And so, people are just like, we don't want her to be on a sticker, trying to sell murdered and missing Indigenous women. Like, please don't do that. Let her spirit rest. And so I think, it's a huge conversation, but Native people have been here. We've been having this conversation and we've been trying to educate people. So at this point, it is absolutely intentional. And, just like this account said, when they said they will step on anybody, they will walk on whoever, they don't care who gets hurt in the process. We need to listen to them because they are telling us exactly who they are. And it's not going to stop. It's horrible. And it's so downright just depressing to even say that. But, when it comes to Indigenous people, when I saw Pocahontas, when I saw Brocahontas, it's just proof that people, especially non-natives, will take any opportunity that they can to be anti-native or anti-Black. Any opportunity they can get to do that, they're going to do it. And so you shouldn't even just expect better of them at this point.
Jen, I mean, we talk about the casual racism that is given to Native American people pretty much by everyone that is not Native. Pocahontas is something that definitely comes front to mind, and it's an offense that is continually compounded. I mean, her experience being, abducted and sex trafficked alone is horrible enough, but then the reframing of her experience with her captor as a love story, horrifying. And then this dickhead Donald Trump wants to turn this Native woman's name into a slur against a white woman claiming Native heritage, questionable Native heritage, right? And then for the slur to be remixed by leftists trying to take a dig at racist Donald Trump. Just like Johnny said, for God's sakes, can we please let Pocahontas rest peacefully instead of resurrecting her and using her name in these derogatory ways, but by non-natives, the ones leading the way with this disgusting use of her name and of her legacy.
I guess I'm just not surprised by it. I'm not surprised by the blatant racism and ableism of it all. And it is, let's keep this in mind, that it is incredibly racist and ableist. Like, this is a dig at people who've had strokes. It's a dig at disabled and ill people, as well as Native people, Native women, particularly, you know, Pocahontas. And it's not uncommon for the left, you know, and I'm so tired of this idea that the left is so great. The left is not great. It has a lot of the same mindset and attitudes of the right wingers. There's racism, sexism, transphobia, all of those different things exist within the left, and all of them exist within the Democratic Party. Like, there's a reason I quit working in that world, and one of them was because of this stuff. Like, you know, this idea that the Democrats are going to come in and save us, you know, the liberals are going to save us is just ridiculous. Like, one, I don't need to be saved. I just need you to get your foot off my neck and let me live. But just, I don't know. I'm not surprised by any of it at all. You know, all the years that I had to uncomfortably laugh off like racist comments and jokes being made about natives while I was working on campaigns. Mm-hmm. You know, I had to hide my health issues and disabilities because I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to get work if word got out that I was like chronically ill and disabled. You know, I mean, I just know from my own experiences and what I've seen, like, this is not new. This is the left. And something that I find kind of ironic about all this stuff as well is that when the Democratic National Convention happened, you know, I wrote a piece for Truth Out about how, you know, this was the DNC with the largest Native gathering presence ever, which doesn't take much to do that. But like I pointed out in the article, like Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids, they're our first two Native women in Congress. You know, how many natives have the Democrats put into federal office? You know, whereas the Republican Party, and like, I'm not giving praise to the GOP, but we've had Native men serving in the Republican Party for quite some time now. Like, yeah, they don't share my politics. I find them atrocious in many ways. But I think it's just really, it's interesting and needs to be pointed out that the Democrats are just now starting to realize, hey, natives exist. Maybe we should talk to them, listen to them, you know. Mm-hmm. But it's like Johnny said, they've been educated. They know. They just don't care. It's the same thing with like the disability aspect. Like, it's still perfectly acceptable to make fun of disabled people. It's still perfectly acceptable to do these things. And, you know, when people call Trump old or crazy or mentally ill and whatnot, or they say racism is a disease, they're not looking at the actual issues of those things. And it's just a really bigoted way of discussing things. Like, we can hold each other accountable without having to degrade one another, you know, like, and if we can't do that, then there's a problem with the people we're listening to and working with and so forth.
Yeah. It's also, you know, I don't know, because I'm just sitting here and I'm reading the YouTube comments. And while we're talking about the left, it's striking me, you know, even Joe Biden. So he's running for president and the whole thing. He sniffs heads of young girls and all this kind. He released not a platform on Native issues where he's going to offer something. He offered like, oh, look at all this stuff that my party has done. His campaign didn't go through the labor to even address Native issues, period, at all. He's got nothing on his plate. he continues to make these weird comments about the Black community too, like, you're not really Black if you don't vote for me. Like, there's just this election in November. One, I believe it's already decided, but two, I'm not convinced that Biden is not kind of like a Trump light. There are some viewpoints that he has that are very similar to Trump. And while Trump may be overt, some of Biden's policies in practice have the exact same thing. So again, it's not the intent, it's the impact. And I think that we should be looking at certain things where it's like, geez, these two cisgendered men, baby boomer men, like, they might not have our best interest in mind. They have the same impact. And people are going to say, oh, I can't believe you compared Biden and Trump. But let's really, really look at it. I mean, I don't know. I'm just really disenfranchised, I suppose.
No, I think you're right, because right before the show, me and Kim were talking, and I told her, I said, the only difference between Biden and Trump is one is orange and the other is white. Like, that's the only difference at this point. We got a Latino and we got a white. That's it.
I mean, and that is an issue. I think a lot of people on the left, on the far left, some younger Black voters as well, having a real existential crisis about, am I voting for Joe Biden here versus Donald Trump? I've talked about this a lot on Stir Crazy. I live in a reliable Democratic state. My state's going to go for Joe Biden if I vote for Mickey Mouse, right? It doesn't really matter. So I have the luxury, the privilege of not having to cast a vote for Joe Biden. I can vote my conscience and not feel guilty or even allow myself to be guilted by Democrats if he loses, right? Oh, it's your fault. You didn't vote for Biden, or you voted third party, or you didn't vote for president at all. I'm not here for vote shaming of anybody. I think this is America, right? You should be able to vote whoever you want to vote. But I do understand that the stakes are high. And perhaps if I lived in a contested state, I might vote differently, but I don't. So these are not questions that keep me up at night. But yeah, no, Desiree, you're 100% right. I mean, when you look at Biden and Trump, it's like, okay, well, Trump, for example, wants to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for oil drilling. As soon as if he was able to do it tomorrow, he would, right? If Joe Biden was president, we would have to convince him not to. Like, he would be, okay with it until he started to hear it from his base that this is not what the base wants. But he would be about it if he didn't have to hear any shit about it. You understand? Like, that's kind of my take on them as well.
Neoliberals every time.
They're fucking worse.
Every time.
From the comments, we've got some comments, ladies. Paul X BSOG says, hating 45 does not excuse racism at all. It's just playing into his game, which is correct. I know Black Magic had something to say. Black Magic says, both sides defend this racist colonial system and only want to control it at the helm, not change anything. That's correct. 100% correct. Ladies, I want us to move along because there was a story. I don't know who posts some of the stories in our show docs sometimes. So when I see them, I'm like, ooh, this is a surprise. But it was a story about a homeless encampment in Minneapolis that mostly houses Native people. And, Jen, you've talked about this. Johnny and Desiree, I think you guys have also spoken about this to another extent, about the experience of the urban indigenous person. People automatically assume when they hear Native American, oh, they must come from a reservation. They must live on a reservation. No, that's not the case. And the experience of people who are Native also living in cities is a very different experience. But a lot of people, especially in this economy, are hurting worse than they have ever before. And the Native communities in the city, the urban Native communities are not immune to that. Dwayne, let's take a look at that video if we could.
It's become known as the Wall of Forgotten Natives, a piece of MnDOT property near Hiawatha and Franklin in Minneapolis, where homeless men, women, and families live in tents.
I don't know why we get pushed constantly or threatened or brought to jail for trying just to live somewhere.
This is where many homeless Native Americans lived 2 years ago. Many retreated back here Wednesday, moved from where they were camped on public property nearby, saying they have nowhere else to go.
You've been told no so many times and you get shut down so many times that you just learn to put your head down and walk away. You've become empty and hopeless.
Native leaders say the inaction and lack of accountability from all levels of government has put them right back here in the very same position they were in 2018.
We need to do better for our Native and non-Native relatives who are sleeping outside and sleeping in places unfit for human habitation.
Native American leaders say the weather is changing. Winter will be here soon. Something needs to be done now.
This is the third winter in a row that our community has had to call out to our state, county, and city elected officials to help us put a plan together to save lives and to care for people who are sleeping outside.
Leaders are demanding elected officials who control the resources to support the community and find housing.
Without our people and without the support, I can guarantee you most of us won't make it out here.
The city of Minneapolis says it met with state and county partners Thursday afternoon to discuss how to help people who relocated to the encampment at Franklin and Hiawatha, and says a culturally specific 24-hour, 50-bed emergency shelter for the city's Native American population is set to open in December. Jessica Miles, 5 Eyewitness News.
Now, Hennepin County says there continues to be unused shelter beds every night that can be accessed by calling this number at 612-248-2350. Again, it's here on the screen. It's 612-248-2350. They have beds available.
That report was from KSTP TV in Minneapolis. Ladies, I know, obviously, when we see stories about people being unhoused, having to deal with keeping the police off of their backs just to wake up and live another day, is something that is being experienced by a lot of people. But Native people have been on the vulnerable side of a lot of these issues, even before 2020 hit the fan, right? Even before the pandemic, even before the economy crashed, a lot of these people were experiencing, housing insecurity, food insecurity in urban areas before 2020. Johnny J, when you see that report, first of all, the fact that they're saying that they're going to open a culturally specific homeless shelter or shelter with 50 beds in December in Minnesota. Well, that seems a little late from my take. It's going to be way cold in Minneapolis by December. So maybe they should try to get that open sooner before winter actually hits. But Johnny, talk to us about the experience of urban indigenous folks and why it's almost an unknown experience or an experience that people are not all that familiar with, and how it differs from that of like the Black urban experience, the white urban, the Latinx urban experience. How is it different being Native and living in a city and dealing with all the issues that still impact Native as a vulnerable, marginalized group?
Well, we've said it time and time again, we're less than 2% of the U.S. population. And one of the biggest issues that we face is erasure. And when it comes to urban natives, a majority of natives actually live in urban areas. And we are pretty much invisible within those communities. We are very ambiguous, I guess you would say, because when people see us, they don't often think that we're Native American. They will think we're Latino or, Filipino is one that I get a lot here in LA. They will think that we're almost every other race except Native American because Native people are just invisible in our own lands. And when it comes to homelessness, it's such a heart-wrenching issue because there's so many nuances to it. And when you're looking at this story out of Minnesota, it just really hits you in the gut because these are people who are just trying to live. And this is a homeless encampment for Native people. And Native people have always been communal. So that's why you find homeless Natives kind of grouping together, staying together, creating their own communities. And when you see this talk of a shelter being open that is culturally specific in December, it's too late because winter, it's September, but when you're up in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, you never know when winter's coming. I've been in South Dakota working a summer camp and it snows in the middle of summer. So it's too late to open a shelter in December. But not only that, a lot of these Native communities have figured out how to survive on the streets. They've learned how to survive whatever, whether it's lack of resources, they've learned to survive that by staying together. But now you have them being criminalized. You have people coming in and arresting them for just trying to find a place to stay. And they were giving this number, saying, oh, well, these shelters have empty beds every night. So call this number and you could come sleep here. But that's not the reality. If you've ever been homeless, you know that in order to get into a shelter, they make you jump through so many hoops. And for a lot of people, that is not feasible. Not only that, but a lot of Natives, it's not just individuals, it's families. And a lot of shelters don't allow for families to stay together. And so that's one of the huge hurdles that Indigenous people face, especially when you're homeless. And I know this from experience because I've been homeless myself on several occasions throughout my life. And it's hard. It's not just as easy of being like, oh, there's a shelter. Let me go stay at this shelter. A lot of shelters, not only do they make you jump through hoops, but they're also very unsafe for women and children. Like they're just not a safe place to be. And not only that, if you're someone like me who's immunocompromised, being around people, you don't know if they're sick, like it just brings up so many different issues. But this story really hits me, and mainly because if you really listen to them talk about this, they're showing this horrible just injustice of Native people being arrested for being homeless, of finding this area where they can gather and just try to survive. But at the same time, Hennepin County is actually bragging that just this year, 1,200 people have gone from being homeless, and whether it's unsheltered homeless or whether it's staying in a shelter, to permanent housing. But again, you have to look at how anti-Native and anti-Black these communities are. You're looking at Hennepin County. This is where George Floyd was murdered. This is where Natives have been shot by police and brutalized as well. So it's not a huge leap to say that the reason that there are so many Natives just being left on the streets and being criminalized is because of that racism and because of that prejudice and bias that exists within this community. And it just makes me so angry because there are so many people who are there through no fault of their own. And they have jumped through the hoops. They have reached out for resources. They've done everything that they can to make sure that they can at least just survive. And Minnesota has such a huge Native population. Minneapolis has a huge Native community, and they really do work to try and make sure that everyone is taken care of. But of course, people are going to slip through the cracks when you don't have the resources to provide the help that people need. And it's just heartbreaking because, winter is coming. I live here in LA, and homelessness is a growing problem here. Right down the block from me, there is a homeless encampment that's probably about 2 blocks long at this point. And, these people, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we have cities, we have a nation that no one is taking this seriously. No one is looking at people rent protection. No one is looking at freezing rent. Everyone is just left to be on their own right now. And there's so many people who are going to be facing eviction. There's so many people who are already homeless. It's a mess. And it's so heartbreaking because honestly, it doesn't have to be this way. And if anything that this pandemic has taught us is that the resources that we need to survive this and to get by, they're there, but they just don't want to give them to the people. And I think that's the most angering thing of all.
And, you know, obviously, Johnny, you bring up an excellent point when you talk about resources and so-called lack of resources. We know that the government doesn't lack resources, right? It's about where they choose to spend it. And when we see the budgets of these police departments being hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions of dollars, depending on where you are, Jen, without a doubt, abolish the police and defund the police is a Native issue when we are seeing the police being sicked upon unhoused Native communities just because they are unhoused.
Yeah, I mean, I think law enforcement gets used on houseless people all the time, Native or otherwise. I see it all the time in DC. You know, Metropolitan Police Department gets called in to clean out an area where there are tents set up where houseless people are sleeping. You know, I've watched them push around. There's a houseless man that I was just kind of sitting back and watching as he was getting some care from EMTs, and then the police show up and the police are like, "You have to leave." And he said to them, "Well, I'm homeless. Where do you want me to go?" And they're like, "We don't know, but you can't be here." And he's like, "So if I walk down the street, you going to come down there and tell me to move again?" And that's what law enforcement does with houseless people. That's how they treat them. And for Native people, we have been moved around since 1492. We are constantly being moved, whether it's putting us in a reservation or it's, you know, the 1950s termination era when the United States government made so many promises to our people, telling them move to urban areas, you'll get good schooling, good jobs, good housing. And then we moved to these cities and we got here and there were no good jobs and there was no good housing. There was no money. It was just another system of poverty. And, you know, you have to think too, like there's a reason certain communities have higher rates of houselessness, you know, and when you look at a history of trauma, that's going to play a role. You know, we know Native people have extremely high rates of disabilities and chronic illnesses. Well, disabled people have really high rates of houselessness because finding disability accessible housing is really hard. And then to find affordable disability housing is practically impossible. And that goes too sometimes with shelters. You know, even if a shelter is ADA compliant, that doesn't mean that they have people on staff who know American Sign Language, for example. You know, like there's a reason certain groups of people are houseless, you know, and it's the same thing with queer folks and for gender nonconforming people, you know, trans, non-binary people, two-spirits, they get discriminated against and turned away at shelters all the time. It happens all the time. In Los Angeles, the houseless rate was so high for Native people that there's an area in downtown LA known as Indian Alley because there were just so many houseless Native people there, you know. And it doesn't have to be this way. There's no reason for anyone in this country to be without a home, food, education, healthcare, none of this stuff. And there's sure as hell no reason for Natives to be houseless on our own lands. Like there's just, it's not a lack of resources, it's purposeful, you know.
The CDC on September 1st actually temporarily halted evictions because 23 million Americans were facing eviction. 23 million. They cited COVID-19, and again, it's temporary. A lot of the different states have put moratoriums on evictions, but at least what's happening in Colorado, houseless relatives, if they're forcibly moved by police, their option is to go to the Western Stock Emporium where they auction off cattle, and there are armed Army Corps of Engineer officers there at the shelter cattle auction thing. The women and non-men, the option, so everybody is separated, you can stay indoors, but the cattle auction arena is built on an environmental Superfund cleanup site. So they have put the women and non-men up for the show, just like cattle, and put people in an unsafe environmental Superfund site with armed guards. Like, I know very little about COVID and I just have been quarantined because I have reactive airway disease from police violence at Standing Rock. But you can't, that's not an option for people. And then to put, firstly, armed Army Corps of Engineer guards, like, what is this, prison? The thing that's really starting to concern me is like, okay, so we've got these two situations. We have a lot of unhoused, like landless Indigenous folks. The private prison system is becoming like a housing authority for Native people because they've criminalized so many people. So you can go into a jail, you can go into a cattle auction jail, or you can be with your relatives in a communal setting where things are open air and feel safer and have the psychosocial support that is needed when you're experiencing houselessness. So I don't really feel that people have a choice when you put it out like that and you're like, okay, well, what would I do? I would go be with my relatives. You know, I wouldn't want to go to any form of, armed anything. So it's pretty offensive, but I think it's good that the CDC is coming out so strong to halt evictions, albeit temporary. Hopefully there is some movement because I know in multiple cities, I can only really speak to Denver because that's the region that I know and work in. There are 11,000 plus empty luxury apartment homes, like just sitting there. And we have under 10,000 houseless relatives at any given time without COVID. So we could house the houseless in luxury apartments. We have the housing. It's just, the capitalists don't want to give up space for anybody but whoever's paying. It's just sickening.
Everything about the way this country was founded and the way that it continues to operate hundreds of years later is just, it's anti-people, right? I mean, everything, how from having to pay for food, having to pay for shelter, having to pay for water, for God's sakes. I mean, someone else made this point on social media, but literally, I mean, the dawn of capitalism is truly the first time in human civilization that humans have been required to actually pay for these things, where we actually have to pay for shelter and pay for food and pay for water. And it's unnatural. It's inhumane, quite frankly. And hopefully in our lifetime, ladies, we will see the end of this devilish, unjustified system of being, because capitalism only serves a very small few, and especially it is completely antithetical to the way that Native and Indigenous people lived for tens of thousands of years unbothered by Europeans and by capitalism. And not to say there wasn't intra fighting between tribes over resources and land during that time, of course, but it was not like it is right now. So yeah, I hope that we can come to the conclusion of this, and I hope that we will be alive to see it. But unfortunately, we have run out of time for this First Nation Friday. Now, before we say goodbye, Jen Derenwater, I know there was an event coming up dealing with disability rights, sponsored by an Indigenous group. If I have that correct, can you share that with us?
Yes. So that is Indigenous Spoonies Revolt, Disability and Chronic Illness and Indigenous Arts.
Tell us what a spoonie is real quick. I'm sorry, don't mean to cut you off. What's a spoonie?
So spoonie is a term that some disabled and ill people use. It's based off the spoon theory. I'll try to explain that very quickly. It's basically like you start off every day with a certain amount of spoons, and each spoon represents your energy for the day. And so every time you've depleted your energy, you take a spoon away or so forth. It's a way of trying to show the amount of energy that it takes kind of just for disabled and ill people to survive. Like everyday things that the abled take for granted, like having to go grocery shopping or something, like that can be really exhausting and difficult for us. So that's the spoon theory sort of in a nutshell. Anyway, so Indigenous Spoonies Revolt, Disability and Chronic Illness and Indigenous Arts. It is co-sponsored by my organization, Crushing Colonialism, and the Disability Project. So it's featuring Tony Enos, Kira Sherwood, O'Regan, and Frank Waln. So Tony is a musician, Kira's a writer and an activist, and Frank is a Lakota rapper. And so they're each gonna do some of their art, show us some of their expressive creative side, and then we're gonna have just a conversation about disability and illness and what that means for us as Indigenous artistic folks. And this is on September 15th at 7 p.m. We're releasing it on that day in both New Zealand and the US. And the website that you can find the event on is crushingcolonialism.live/Indigenous Spoonies, and that's SPOONSIES Revolt. Or you can just go to crushingcolonialism.org.
Wonderful. So, gang, that sounds like something very interesting that people should definitely check out on September 15th. And you can follow Crushing Colonialism and Jen on Twitter to get more information and details about that. Well, ladies, there was one other thing I had on the docket, but I think it will just take too much time for us to talk about it. But I will hold it until next First Nation Friday, because it's about Indian sovereignty. And what's the governor of Oklahoma's name? Governor Shit? Is it Shit?
Although it should be Shit, it really should be.
Well, Governor Shit is talking shit about, he's pissed about, the McGirt decision and the Supreme Court ruling that in effect restored tribal sovereignty. And, the white supremacist structure, they don't want to hear no parts of that. And they got to do something something must be done about that. So I know that's going to take a bit of time to discuss. So we will put a pin on that and hold that for next First Nation Friday. I'd like to thank our fantastic panel. As usual, Desiree Kane, Johnny J, Jen, Deer and Water. Ladies, thank you guys so much for being here. Again, I love these conversations. We will just keep having them in perpetuity. And thank everybody else for watching too. There's a lot of people in the comments, so we appreciate everybody checking us out.
Have a good week, everybody. Catch you later, or weekend.
Yes. Labor Day, y'all. Enjoy that day off. Enjoy it. Sleep, smoke weed, do whatever you want to do. Just lay about.
If you have the day off, it's because of unions. So don't forget the labor movement.
100%. That's right. Thank a union for having Monday, Labor Day off. Folks, don't forget, coronavirus, COVID-19 is still out here jumping on people. So please, they being the CDC, are even suggesting if you're having a family gathering, keep it to only 2 or 3 people. One of the main modes of transmission they have found for the coronavirus has been small family gatherings, not even the big, ridiculous parties at Lake of the Ozarks like we've seen pictures of some of our other country people doing. No, it's when you get together with your family and someone has coronavirus and they don't know they have coronavirus, and then they give it to everybody else in the house. So try to keep your distance, wear your mask, wash your hands, be outside as much as possible, and try to keep yourself safe. COVID is killing people. I do not want it to kill you. So that's it. Have a great weekend, and we will see you back here for Stir Crazy on Tuesday. See y'all later. Bye.